Good morning, Ben.
How are you, Sally?
Good. Glad to be here. It was a bit of a challenging morning.
Learning is always challenging.
Absolutely. But we are here, Chapter 5 today, change, innovation and disruption. It's quite an appropriate topic, really. One of the quotes at the start of this chapter is, the quickest way to find out who your enemies are is to try doing something new. Yong.
Yeah, isn't that the truth, eh?
Absolutely.
Any major change generically produces its own resistance. And, just even with what we're doing with this podcast is an interesting experience, we're learning about new technology, which certainly for me, and I suspect for you, requires significant change, which neither of us are managing especially well. And
we're getting there.
It's just hard, it requires, a whole process of letting go of what we knew and trying to learn something new. And anyone who's tried any form of learning will know that there's a whole series of phases you go through, not the least.
And it's so tempting to default back to what's comfortable or tried and tested,
Absolutely.
ways of working, rather than going with, this is meant to be helping me, but it's such a hindrance to learn it that I'm not sure if I can be bothered to persist. But if you do persist, well, then with that effort, you gain mastery, and then you get, the enlightenment and enjoyment of the spoils of that new learning. But it's certainly a challenge.
It's over the years. I mean, I've undertaken myriads of learning projects, and all of them have caused significant angst in different ways. You go through that early phase of, one of the things I did try was skiing, and when I was in my mid-40s, Sally and I decided that we wanted to learn to ski. And I'd always had a pretty charmed life as a student. I was never the top of the class, but I did things comfortably, and I never had to be the child at the bottom of the class who struggled. Until I learned skiing, and I all of a sudden became very, very conscious of my limited competence and the fact that I was the one in the class who was at the bottom. And it was a seriously uncomfortable experience. So I can't imagine, I couldn't imagine up until then how difficult it would be for kids at school who struggled, And it's not very different with the computer technology. We've seen those massive changes. And it doesn't matter which one. One of the stories I tell in the book is that I found an ad in a magazine once, and I kept it because I thought it was so interesting. It was an advertisement selling electricity in the 1930s, and they were actually market electricity. Now, in today's world, that's almost incredible. Now they kind of market it a bit in terms of pricing, but back then you had to get people to change from wood stoves and kerosene lanterns. And so, the people were slow to do that because they knew the wood worked. My mum remembers her family having a wood stove.
Yeah.
So those sorts of changes, were big in those days, and we've now got a whole language around it, even since I started in this whole arena. When I started many years ago, they used to talk about training change agents so that you'd have good change agents, So change was a great word, but, we now have, innovation as part of the process of change, and we now have disruption. So there's all of those words, all one way or another, describing the same sorts of things. And it's a whole social process, if you like. We all know the marketing new product development thing model about leaders and laggards. You know, some people love to be on the front end of things, so they love buying the shiny new whatever it is. But there's a whole host of people, and we know them, who still haven't got their heads around the first mobile phone, you know. Or if they have,
Yes, and
moved past the first mobile. I know I've got colleagues who still have their very first mobile phone because they haven't really, although they're whinging a bit now because the technology's changing and they can't get anything done. So the little things like that you see happening, you know. So, you know, we're living in a...
And then you see advancements too, Ben, where is it actually any better than what we had before? So there's often not just the resistance to moving with the times, but also the resistance to really challenging whether the status quo of the adoption of new technologies or new ways of working is actually any better. So sometimes the laggers, there's a sophistication in their delay, which is helpful.
Well,
because we revolt back to something that we learnt 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Or we didn't learn, so we flipped and changed it so many times to see when would we finally adopt it, but when really it was already sorted out 60 years ago, for example.
Yeah, look, I think that's an argument that a lot of people like to make, but in the end, inevitably, the changes occur whether you want them to or not. You know, you might retain your view of the world and a worldview that says this is how it is, but in the end, change, we don't get to control it in our lives effectively. You know, stuff just happens around you, you know, and you either get in the game or you miss out. And, you know, the technology is the one in our generation that we've had to manage. But, you know, there are life changes that happen that you get no control over. And you know, Kubler-Ross wrote about it best when she talked about the death and dying, the process after death and dying, you know. But William Bridges described it best when he talked about the three stages, you know, that go on in a major change process. The first is the confrontation with it, you know, where there's a whole range of things that, you know, Kubler-Ross had described, denial and anger and frustration and all of those words. But that's the early part of the transition cycle. You know, it's a psychological process. That we have to manage, and it really can be very challenging. You know, for many of us, it means we have to learn, in some ways, a new language, and you know, that takes time. Then there's a period of time, which Bridges describes as the wilderness period. So the change has happened, and you can't go back. You know, it's a little bit like what's happening with the COVID. You know, we're in what's called a liminal time, and I think we're still in it. You know, we can't go back, and we don't know what the future is, so we're kind of in a time between times. And we don't really know what the new world looks like, you know. And that wilderness period generates a whole lot of emotion about inadequacy and the feelings of loss and fear and is something happening that I don't understand? And I've worked with people in the middle of some of this, and I've never forgotten working with a group of scientists, and we had this conversation about this model, Bridges, and we were talking about wilderness, and one of the guys, almost in tears, said, "Gee," he said, I thought this sense of loss that I had was just me. I didn't know everyone was experiencing it." And then we had this amazing conversation among, back then it was about 16 men and 2 women, who talked about the fear of the change that they'd never talked about before. It might be 20 years ago. And they all had this sense of inadequacy or loss or fear, or some of them were still angry about what had happened. And it was a real awakening for them that, hey, you can talk about this stuff, and it is important to talk about it because everybody at some level is struggling. And it was a real, and in that process, then, we moved into another set of meetings that allowed them to talk about, well, what was possible given these things had changed. And we started to see, and Bridges talks about it as new beginnings.
I think really understanding how people, like the emotional state of change, is really critical, isn't it?
Oh, I think, and it's something we don't pay enough attention to.
Absolutely, no, I agree.
And even if you look back in Australia at some of the things that have happened in time, when we did the economic restructuring in the 90s, there was a whole range of things happened then that caused the Australian business world to take stock, and there was a period of time there where people were suffering from what they called change fatigue. They were saying that there's too much of it. And so how can we slow it down? And the reality is we can't. If you look back in time, this has been happening for eons. It's just one of the things that's different now is that we know about it and we see more about it, and the media talks more about it. But if you think about, cars replaced horses, refrigeration replaced blocks of ice, air travel was a revolutionary concept when it happened. And so we just kind of look, and now we have things like Uber and Airbnb and a whole range of things that are profoundly different and have either changed or disrupted industries. But everybody thought we're going to be like that for the rest of their lives. It's been a fascinating journey. And now COVID.
Do you think it's accelerated, Ben? Do you think that there's been just as much change in the last sort of 70 years as there has been in just the last 10, or do you think it's more?
Look, possibly it's – look, it's hard to say because, I didn't live through the Depression and I didn't live through the Second World War, but I imagine that there was a huge amount of very fast changes that occurred in each of those windows of time that people had to learn to cope with. Post the Second World War, we had a period, certainly in Australia and dare I say the rest of the world, of relative stability. And then the baby boomers came along, if you like, and they stirred everything up. They started to challenge all the existing institutions, and that's caused its own kind of level of turbulence for our generation. But, as a baby boomer, I'd have to say that COVID is the most profoundly jarring change I've seen in my lifetime. And, from all perspectives, it seems like as a country and as a generation, we've managed it relatively well compared to other places. It doesn't mean we couldn't have done it a lot better, but we've done well. But I think it's a platform for a new future. And the question in Australia, I think, is, are we up for it? That's the real challenge, because there's a whole lot of stories in Australia where people have had big ideas or big visions, and one way or another they get their wings clipped or they get pulled down in a way. We're a little bit afraid of dreaming big, but now would be a good time, in my view, to actually dream big, if you like. What is the platform for a prosperity for our grandchildren? I think that's a question that we really need to be grappling with as a result of COVID. And we need to manage this transition, people who are struggling with the change, everything from, the obvious things, working from home. and the technological shifts. Look how you and I have struggled with it, just in trying to get this podcast working. I mean, that's an example of change, as I mentioned earlier. But there's a whole range of other things in Australia we've got the opportunity to do if we've got the courage, I think, and it takes courage. I mean, it really is. Now is the time, in my view, to open the conversation about the possibilities for the future. It's, I don't know, I think now is a great time, and we've just got to grab it by the throat and do something important with it.
And I think, like here in Melbourne, they had on the news the other night, they did a piece on bringing back people into the CBD and the fact that there was lots of small shops that were second and third generation businesses that have now closed and moved back out, or moved out for the first time to the suburbs because the foot traffic was no longer in the CBD, and they just couldn't survive there anymore. And there's so many buildings that are empty that what are we going to do with those spaces? And although there's a level of grief and loss to sort of, I guess, cope with that shift, but then at some point you have to say, well, okay, but where are we now? A bit like that team you were talking about. Once we've identified how we feel about how things are and what we've lost, and there's some level of acceptance, then it's, well, what if? Well, what are the new horizons for us? How else do we use the space? And I'm going to keep watching to see what happens in Melbourne CBD as to what does change there, because I think it's quite interesting to see how we will use those buildings and for what purpose, and will there be more people living in the city, or will they use them for the arts or music and things like that? What will they do with it?
Well, I think that's true. And I mean, there's a similar sort of conversation happening, I think, throughout the world about some of these issues, and it has to be, because the sorts of changes that have occurred in the context of COVID have been earth-shattering, like from and we're an older couple, Sally and I, but, we were travelling overseas twice a year to see kids.
Yeah.
We haven't done that now for 18 months, and I can't see that we'll be doing it in the next 18 months. That they're simple things, but even moving between states is a challenge, and certainly for us now in lockdown, but our son was coming up for Easter with his family. Well, he's not coming anymore, and we've given up so many freedoms, if you like, that we're allowing the government to tell us what to do. Now, that's a huge shift in our psyche. We're signing into every restaurant with a government system. There's a whole range of things. I can remember a debate in Australia when we wouldn't allow them when they wanted to introduce a health card or something, and we wouldn't let the government have the number. Because, and it was just really, we were quite paranoid and protective of our privacy. Now it's all unfolding. And if you think about it, the technological changes, irrespective of COVID, the technological changes that were coming, whether COVID happened or not, artificial intelligence. Just think about the possibility of a business running by artificial intelligence alone, with little or no human intervention in the decision making. That's pretty big change.
It's a massive change.
Robotic.
And how effective will that be? Because of there'll always be some level of human interaction, because it will be that artificial intelligence will create a service or a product or something that humans will then use. So therefore there's humans at the beginning and the end of each process. And I kind of think, well, what disruption will the humans create that will possibly debunk the AI?
Yeah, well, that's the question, though, and it's how the human system manages some of this stuff. Robotics is another example.
Yes.
And I've got clients now who, in the space of 5 years, have transformed their business from being it was certainly a technology-based business, but now they've moved into robotics and what do they call it? The virtual reality.
Oh, yes, VR.
Design. Yep. And it's just an augmented reality. And it's just extraordinary. It looks like they're starting a new business in the whole area of using that technology as a design tool. The whole area of energy storage is coming. We're not going to see a serious drop in global emissions unless we move to uranium and or maybe both, a miracle in terms of energy storage. As important as climate change is and as important as carbon emissions is, and there's no question that it needs to be done, unless we get revolutionary stuff happening in this country around uranium, which we can't do at the moment, for all sorts of social, political reasons, or unless we get a radical, miraculous sort of change in the energy storage system, we're going to struggle with climate change. And they're big things that have to be addressed. The whole area of DNA sequencing and how that could have potentially affect human life, but even more and bigger potentially affect animal life at a whole range of levels. From decreasing cows farting to changing the nature and quality of the food chain through genetic management. And then you've got the whole system called blockchain coming.
Yeah.
Which, many of us have heard about. Not many of us have a clue about how to manage it. And at the moment, the best thing it's doing is kind of creating a few wealthy people. But, the downsides are big too. I was just listening in this week to someone talking about this technology shift with young people, and for young men, and this might interest you, addiction is the big issue with technology. For young, it's self-esteem.
Yes, I've read something on this too, actually.
Yeah. Like all of this change, whether it's technology or whether it's some of the other things we talked about, is having huge social implications, and it's affecting one way or another. It's affecting how the next generation prepares for the future. And, of course, they'll be prepared for it, probably better than we were prepared for ours because they're getting access to more information earlier. But one of the things that always fascinates me about change and learning, some of the greatest changes you make in life happen after you're born, or they're learning events, if you like. You learn how to walk, and not too many children don't learn how to walk. For some it takes longer than others, but in the end, just through sheer bloody-minded persistence, every child learns to walk.
Yeah.
And what's even harder? Learning to talk.
Yep.
Every child, learns at a rate. If you watch your own kids, all of them talk. Most of them talk pretty well. So, the whole process of learning and change is it's just a lifelong journey, and the people who struggle are the people who get stuck in a worldview or a position, and I think that's the challenge Australia faces. Right at the minute, we're all way too comfortable.
We are, I suppose, in a state where there are lots of comforts in our country, isn't it? We're very lucky to be here, and I think sometimes there's a part of that that's almost overwhelming how many opportunities people do have, and looking to other people. And there's a context around Australians being so fortunate and the wealth in Australia, yet there's plenty of people that are really struggling as well. So I see that shift in the haves and the have-nots happening more, and that's a certain change that I don't like that I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
that's a big part of advancement. Yeah,
there's no question that the economic system, or the profile of the economic system, has changed dramatically. And what we're seeing is, and it's certainly more visible in the United States than it is here, or more manifest anyway, is what's called a hollowing out of the middle class. You've got more rich people, and you've got more poor people. And the middle, what used to be a parabolic curve. You had the rich, you had the middle class, and you had the lower class, if you like. Democracy depended on a system like that, where there was the opportunity for people to increase their life position, wealth position. Certainly in some countries, the economic system, the globalized economic system, has created a race for the bottom, which has allowed many of the rich to get much, much richer, and many of the poor to get much, much poorer. So we have almost a Pareto curve instead of a 30 or a 15, 60, 15 equation. You now have a 20-80 equation.
Yes, and isn't it interesting how you can transfer that lens onto like product ranges, for example?
Oh, yeah.
Products that are produced in Australia or in general, or imported into Australia, but product ranges that you see in our supermarkets and in our specialty retail shops, that there's a race to the bottom, and then there's also this high-end luxury market.
That's right.
And there's the middle. The middle is becoming hollow, and you also see it in the built environment, where there's just so many. The housing boom has created a huge amount of race to the bottom for dwellings that just are not fit for longevity. They're not going to last.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the other end of that, there are luxury houses that are at a scale and a build quality that will last 100 years.
Oh, so, I think we've got it's a real challenge for dare I say, the next generation, in terms of how they're going to manage this kind of polarity in distribution of wealth. At the moment, Australia is one of the richest countries in the world. There's no question about it. But it's in the process of stagnation. And Ross Garnaut has just published a book called The Great Reset, and he talks about the period over the last 30 years. And we had the big economic reform period in the late 80s, early 90s. And then for about 10 or 12 years, we had a huge series of productivity increases and wage increases. And that kind of came to an end early 2000s. And we went into a period of, we were lucky, we went into a period of high economic growth, but mostly driven out of the China boom. So it wasn't anything we did. It was the fact that China all of a sudden needed more resources than we could ever dream of. And so we sold it to them. But at the same time as that was happening, over that 20 years, we actually allowed our manufacturing system to drop and to fade away almost. And we're now dependent on China for a whole range of inputs that leaves us quite vulnerable. So we had those changes occurring in that 20 years. And then the last 10 years, Garnaut talks about the dog days. And it's a period of time when Australia has actually slipped into a stagnation that is going to be very hard to change. And that's not hard to reconcile when you think about it, because we had a period where, how many prime ministers did we have in 10 years? And so there was a complete absence of leadership on important issues. There's no doubt there was leadership. There were people in jobs and they had hobby horses and we did stuff. But it comes back to the thesis that I have. Even, the Hawke years or the Hawke-Keating years was the only time in my lifetime when we've actually genuinely had a conversation about increasing the size of the pie, which, in economic terms is called wealth creation. For the last 10 years, and certainly for most of my life, we've never talked about it at all. We're pretty good at talking about wealth redistribution. And I think we need to open the conversation about what sort of nation-building innovations we want to see over the next 50 years. And no one seems to be willing to have a crack at it. I think that's the question. What sort of prosperity are we leaving for the next generations,
Yeah, and can the Business Council of Australia, could they set up an innovation, industry bodies to do that, like you've mentioned here in the book, Ben, where we're looking over a 50-year period. That's really, it leads us into the next chapter, the challenge, doesn't it?
All right, let's just have a break there.
Thank you.